So the project that I have been working on for the last 3 years has been an educational social networking project that connects kids around the world in 5 countries: Australia, Norway, 2 sites in the US, South Africa, and India. And for my dissertation project, I wrote about 5 teachers and their adolescent students at the first 5 sites that we founded. So the teachers had been with the project for a while and were really struggling. And we noted that we couldn't figure out what to do about the struggle. And so that was the genesis of my project. And so I tried ethnographically to explore with the teachers what the nature of the struggle was and to document how they were thinking about using social networking in educational spaces, some of which was in school, some out of school, and some kind of in a hybrid between them. This was a design research project created by Glenda Hull and Mark Nelson from UC Berkeley that was designed to look at how kids exchanged stories and talked across differences around the world. And it grew out of some digital storytelling work that Glenda Hull had been doing for years, where she actually physically brought stories back and forth to these different countries that she visited. And kids made these digital stories, and then she thought, what would happen if they could exchange these stories in 2008 on a social network, which was really kind of just developing. There were no real tools to do it, and so some of our first iterations were pretty rudimentary. And the goal was to get kids themselves to design the network and to think about what kinds of functionality would they want and what kinds of aesthetic design. But this was a really difficult task because kids had MySpace mostly then, and a little bit of Facebook, although kids weren't really on Facebook as much in the early days. And then, of course, some of the kids in some of the places hadn't been on social networks at all. So they really had a hard task trying to imagine. So it kind of fell to the teachers to try and help them imagine what could be possible. And yet we came back to the challenge of the teachers not really knowing how to do it. They were trying to really empower the kids to make their own decisions. They didn't want to put their own expectations on the process. So they were really trying to let kids drive the process. Social networking for all of the teachers, despite their belief that it could be used in education, was really primarily a self-sponsored practice that kids could do on their own and that they really didn't need guidance in working on. And the problem with that, though, was that we were having the kids also help to design and think about the nature of social networking and how they would design this network called Space to Create that we were working with them to do. And so the teachers needed to take a more facilitative role where they actually got in and worked with the students and tried to develop kind of critical digital literacy practices around the network. But they didn't feel comfortable doing that. And it really linked to their belief that social networking and these kinds of social practices that kids were enacting on there, chatting with friends and posting media that they found and talking about that, were really things that were separate in some ways from more traditional academic work. And while that may involve kind of informal learning, the teacher didn't really have a place in that, and it was kind of supportive or supplemental in some ways rather than central. Until the teacher stepped in and actually started creating opportunities and helping students think about the ways that they might participate on the social network kind of in an educationally turned manner, nothing really happened on there. So it ended up becoming a central tension throughout the whole project and really manifested in the lack of interaction on the network. So the kids were getting on there, but they weren't necessarily talking to one another. They were viewing things, and we could see that they were actually engaged, but they weren't commenting. And so they really needed more scaffolding and more kind of teacher-directed support about how do you talk to people from other countries whose language may not be English, and you have to find other ways to communicate. And so the network afforded different kinds of modalities. So you could post music, and you could like the music, give a thumbs up to the music, and you can post images, and you can post images in response to images, but kids didn't really know how to do that until teachers pointed out that it was possible. I would have anticipated more resistance and more reticence, but I instead encountered, and I can't even think of one example to the contrary, where kids made a very genuine and very concerted effort to be respectful and thoughtful communicators with one another. So they spent a lot of time crafting messages, crafting their pages, thinking about how to respond. And in general, trying to create what we've come to call kind of welcoming texts, where they thought about what their peers might need in order to understand and try to support them by putting those in. So, for example, subtitling. So, one young woman in Oakland said, well, I've made this movie, but I'm really worried the kids in Norway won't be able to understand it. I should really try and subtitle it. So she went to Google Translate and tried to figure out how to type some of the letters on there. And so they weren't always successful at it, but it was the efforts to do so and the thoughtfulness in the ways that they worried about it that was really striking to me. And everyone was very willing to take risks, to talk about themselves, to open themselves up and try to speak Norwegian. And I thought that was a really hopeful and optimistic effort that gave me great joy to write about. And a lot of people talk about, the ability to not just engage in these practices, but to really author materials and feel as if one's voice is out in the world. And in fact, we did a lot of interviews with students who talked about that as one of the most transformative pieces of the project, was the ability, my story's now getting heard. And the sense that there was a public out there that wanted to hear it. And I think that was the motivating context to them, was it was a public, but it was a more kind of safe space public, where they knew that everybody on there, they called it the educational Facebook, they knew everybody on there would be supportive. So they were willing to take risks and try new things because it was kind of this safer space to try it out. And it allowed for them to try and author things even though they hadn't maybe made a movie before, and to get feedback on it and to take those kinds of risks. So I think that's an important equity implication, in the sense that when we do this work, to think about how do we provide opportunities for all kids to participate in this. And so if this were more of an institutionalized practice in which kids have these opportunities in school to author in these different ways, these multimodal ways, to kind of take advantage of the semiotic affordances of socially networked composing, for example, that I think more kids would have those opportunities. Because now it's pretty disproportionately the more privileged kids who get those opportunities to do the fancy, fun projects like this. I'd like to kind of work in the scholarly community and thinking about changing the ways people see writing. For example, the teachers assigned blogs quite often, which was really a kind of one-to-many publication model that was very traditional. And so how can we think about extending our kind of theories of what it means to compose in ways that are not necessarily words in these networked contexts where audiences can now comment back and shape the way things are framed. So what are ways we can compose with videos, and how can that support some of our academic kind of goals and larger kind of standards even? And so thinking about changing that conversation and really challenging some of these notions about writing that I think are holdovers from when writing really meant print texts.